Have you ever fallen asleep and had a really vivid dream, and then you swear when you wake up, like in the middle of the night after you have this dream, that you're going to write this down and you're going to remember it tomorrow, and then you wake up the next day and you forget almost all of the dream? Well, this story is about a guy who didn't forget his dream. He remembered his dream. And that dream became a very famous horror story that we still talk about today. And the most interesting thing about this dream was it was a fever dream. He was actually in a nightmare. And so what happened was he was sleeping and he was having this, really interesting, vivid nightmare. And he was screaming and his wife came running up and she woke him from his dream. And he didn't turn to her and go, "Oh, sorry, I'm having a nightmare," or, "Oh, it's okay, I'm fine." Instead, he was very concerned with the fact that he wasn't able to finish this dream. So he turned to her and he said, "Why did you wake me? I was having a fine bogey tale." It was basically like he was saying, "Why did you wake me up in the middle of this when I was getting to the good part?" This story today we're going to talk about is a really bizarre, kind of strange, but yet inspiring story of the author who wrote The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. If you didn't already guess it, I'm talking about Robert Louis Stevenson. He was Scottish, born in 1850 in Edinburgh, and if you don't recognize that name immediately, I promise you know his work. Treasure Island, that's him. Kidnapped, also him. And yes, A Child's Garden of Verses, the poetry collection that most of us grew up reading. He was a man of many talents and had a very creative mind. What most people don't know about Stevenson is that his entire life was essentially a race against his own body. He had serious lung problems from childhood, probably tuberculosis, though they didn't always call it that, and he spent decades being told by various doctors that he was likely dying. While he always responded to this news by writing adventure novels and traveling the world. If today was his last, he wasn't going to waste it. By 1885, he was living in Bournemouth, England, with his wife Fanny and his stepson Lloyd, and he was sick again, which for Stevenson just meant he was in bed instead of at a desk. But the writing was still happening, and then one night, he had a dream. As a side note, some have speculated that his dream may have been stimulated by the medication Stevenson was taking. He was taking ergotine to stop lung hemorrhaging, derived from ergot, which could induce hallucinations, and possibly cocaine, because at that time, it was being investigated for medical benefits, though there's no real proof of this theory. So what was his dream? Stevenson dreamed that a man was being pressed into a cabinet, and after swallowing a drug, he transformed into another being. Stevenson later said the dream was a gift because of how clear the story was to him and how every detail of the story flowed onto paper. But it wasn't without some complications. His stepson, Lloyd, later described it like this. Stevenson came downstairs in a fever, read nearly half the book out loud to them, and then, while Lloyd and Fanny were sitting there completely stunned, he went back upstairs and kept writing. Lloyd said he doubted the first draft even took as long as 3 days. That must have been some sort of fever dream. Anyway, he finished the draft, brought it to Fanny so she could read the text and write her criticisms and notes in the margins. She observed that he'd written something gripping, a real page-turner, good bones, but he'd missed the whole point of his story. He'd written a thriller about a man with a secret life, when what it needed to be was something much deeper. An allegory about the hidden self that every human being carries around.
Allegory, a story where the characters stand for abstract ideas. For example, good and evil.
The respectable face we show to the world, and the darker thing underneath it, fighting for control. For those that failed English class, an allegory is defined as, quote, a story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral or political one. For instance, The Three Little Pigs uses allegory to explain that the pig that put in the most work has the strongest house, so if you work hard, you reap rewards. And Animal Farm by George Orwell is about Russian Revolution, where the farm animals overthrow the owner of the farm. The message is political. So Stevenson's book dealt with the inner struggle of good versus evil, that people possess both noble and base desires, and they aren't always balanced. Even deeper, he reflected the Victorian idea that outward gentility masked inner lusts. In other words, nice guys aren't always nice guys. Repressing your inner dark side can manifest in violent ways. So thank God for Fanny. She not only helped Stevenson create a much better story, but she also tolerated what he did next. So Robert, he didn't take this feedback graciously. There was loud arguing. Lloyd reportedly left the room because he couldn't stand to watch. Basically, Robert threw a man tantrum. But to his credit, Robert came to his senses and realized that his wife was correct. We always are. He said, "You're right. I've absolutely missed the allegory. Take note, dudes." And then he threw the entire manuscript into the fireplace. So he went back to his writing, and at this point, he's still sick with a fever, and doctors are still telling him they're concerned. But Stevenson didn't give a shit. He rewrote it, and in another few days of what everyone around him called feverish industry. And that second version, the one built on Fanny's note, the one where the allegory is the whole point, that's the Jekyll and Hyde that the entire world now knows. Sick and bedridden, Stevenson took advantage of the only thing he could do, and today it's some of the world's most popular fiction. So what's your excuse? But Stevenson didn't invent the idea of a person with a respectable public face and a hidden monstrous self. He observed it. A few different times, actually. So much so it stuck with him. There was a real Edinburgh figure named Deacon Brodie. He was a beloved craftsman, a city councillor, a pillar of the community by every measure, who was also running a secret life as a burglar and gambling addict. When they finally caught him and sentenced him to death, he was, interestingly enough, hanged on gallows that he himself had helped design and build as part of his legitimate career. And then there was a French teacher in Edinburgh named Eugene Chantrel, a friend of Stevenson's, a sociable, charming man who was perfectly normal in every visible way. But he was convicted of poisoning his wife with opium and suspected of having done the same to other people at his dinner parties. Stevenson, he sat through this entire trial, and he later said that as the evidence came out, he felt exactly like Jekyll watching Hyde's crimes unfold. The dawning horror of realizing that someone you thought you knew was something else entirely underneath.
'Cause I was Jekyll, Jekyll, Hyde, Jekyll, Hyde, Hyde, Jekyll. Jekyll, Jekyll, Hyde, Jekyll, Hyde.
So when Stevenson wrote about the hidden self, the dangerous thing that lives inside the respectable person, he wasn't theorizing, he was reporting. Stevenson died 8 years later in 1894 in Samoa, where he'd moved in search of a climate that would be kinder to his lungs. He was 44 years old, and he'd spent most of those years being told his body was failing him while his imagination just kept going. The story of Jekyll and Hyde took only about a week to write, and yet it has a sizable impact on pop culture today. Jekyll and Hyde is used in vernacular today to refer to people who seem like good people on the outside but have a shockingly evil nature. Think Ted Bundy, for example. The book has produced over 120 stage and film versions, numerous audio recordings with many famous readers, a musical, and even video games. So thank you, Fanny, for kicking your husband in the ass so he'd write the novella we all didn't know we needed. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button and share this video with your friends. Thanks for watching. Consider yourself peaked. I don't like that. Nope, sorry. That's wrong.